We'll edit this on the site. All right. So where are you guys at right now?
I am in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Yeah, I've recently, through a series of accidents, begun running the MFA program at Hunter. So
Sounds tragic.
it's a strange, it's all sort of seems rather happenstantial, but there we are.
Yeah.
And Peter, I mean Peter, Paul, you're in Stony Brook, yeah?
Yeah, Stony Brook, Long Island. Similar circumstances. I find myself the director of the MFA program at Stony Brook. And I don't know if I'd want to direct any program that would have me as director.
Oh dear. So yeah, that's where I am at the moment.
Very cool.
You're in Des Moines?
We're in Des Moines.
Yes.
Absolutely. We're in Iowa. So maybe we'll just go ahead and get started here, and we'll do a small introduction. So first off, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Oh, Jade, you can't hear anything. That's a great, maybe that's on my end. Hold on just a minute, make sure I, wow, it's interesting. Can you hear us now, Jade?
The endless whims of Zoom.
I've never had anybody not be able to hear us though before.
Her laptop might be muted.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. I'll type that in really quick, and then we can commence. Leave it at that. Okay. As we go through this, I'll be addressing her issues. Okay. So once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us for our 5th installment of this semester of the Celebration of Literary Arts, sponsored by Des Moines Area Community College. This is our 20th year doing the festival, and we've had an amazing roster of writers this semester, including today, in which we have Paul Harding and Adam Haslett, who will be reading for us very soon. But first, probably want to thank a couple people, because this doesn't happen by itself. So Des Moines Area Community College, of course, Liberal Arts Department, and our Dean, Jim Stick, who has supported us all the time. And we also want to thank we'll call them our sponsors or collaborators, Beaverdale Books, which is our local independent bookstore, who has been with us for 20 years, including this semester, which leads us to talk about you guys, in that we have our readers have been super generous, and in lieu of compensation, they have decided to invest in books. So DMAC has purchased several copies of their books, and we have given many away already, but we like to hold some back until after the reading. So if you are watching the recording or are here live and you would like a copy of their book, just email me at madickinson@dmac.edu, and I'd be happy to send them anywhere in the country. We've actually been sending them far and wide on both coasts, so it's so nice to see people kind of looking from all over the nation at these readings. So we'll just talk a little bit about how this hour will be run. We'll start with a very small introduction by me, and then we will spend the first 15 minutes or so having a conversation with our 2 visiting writers based on questions from students, actually, who submitted them before the reading began. And then we will have a reading from each of the writers for about 10 or 15 minutes from their work. And then we'll end with a kind of a traditional Q&A with this idea of the chat that you have available to you, of course, and the Q&A Dropbox. Or you can, of course, email me too. In fact, I've already seen a few people send an email right now, actually, asking some questions that they have in mind about the authors. So first, without any further ado, we'll begin with Paul Harding, who is the author of 3 novels, Tinkers, which won the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for fiction, his second novel, Enon, and his 3rd and forthcoming book, This Other Eden, coming out in 2023, I believe. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment of the Arts, and the PEN America. He has taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, the Michener Center for Writers, and Harvard University. Currently, he is the director of the MFA program in creative writing and literature at Stony Brook University. He is joined by Adam Haslett, who is the author of 3 works of fiction: Imagine Me Gone, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Critics Circle Award, and winner of the LA Times Book Award. The short story collection, You Are Not a Stranger Here, also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award. And the novel Union Atlantic, winner of the Lambda Literary Award, which recognizes the outstanding contributions made by individuals of the LGBTQ community. His journalism on culture and politics have appeared in Esquire, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Nation, and Atlantic Monthly. He has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, the PEN Malamud and PEN Winship Awards. In 2016, he received the Strauss Living Award for the American Academy of Arts and Letters. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and Yale Law School, he has been a visiting professor at the Iowa Writers Workshop and Columbia University, and he currently lives in New York City. So I just want to welcome both of you and thank you for taking this hour to talk to us.
Great pleasure.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Maybe the first question we can begin with from one of our students. We were talking about both of your guys' work, and we were thinking about the personal. And so the question reads, each of you pull from autobiography in different ways. For Paul, you pull from your own family history and experiences based on friends. And for Adam, your characters often emulate things from your own life, such as familial mental health and LGBTQ communities. So the question is, how do you approach this idea of not just writing about what you know, but where you're from? And how do you balance the fiction and nonfiction elements in ways that speak to art versus authenticity? In other words, can you speak to like the overlap and how you kind of negotiate the real versus the fictional? Adam, do you want to maybe begin thinking about autobiography?
Sure. I guess the way I think about it is there's sort of 2 forms of permission you have to give yourself when you're operating in these waters that question describes. And the first is the permission to indeed use not only the emotional autobiography, which I think all work is, but some of the more tangible, literal sometimes, elements of your own life or the lives of people close to you. But especially because we're talking about fiction, equally important is the second form of permission you have to grant yourself, which is to alter that, which is to say, yes, I am going to draw here, but I am not, this is not portraiture. You know what I mean? That it's allowing myself to tap into hopefully a pretty deep wellspring of knowledge and sense and sensibility on the one hand, but on the other hand, this is a shapely thing. This is a thing. This is a created thing. It has to work unto itself, not as a memoir, or a description of my particular circumstances. So I think people can often, both forms of permission can be hard to grant. You can be hard to give yourself the permission to take from your life, but then you can equally well get caught in saying, well, but it didn't really happen this way, and feeling as though there's a sort of necessary fidelity. So those are the sort of things I try to be conscious of going through, and you don't grant those permissions just once. You do it daily, I think.
Just kind of adding on that, I love this idea of permission. Do you ever run into ethical dilemmas that you yourself kind of have to debate in terms of like stealing from life if it affects other people? We had a conversation today in our poetry class, which somebody was writing something about very personal, but they're like, maybe I shouldn't write this because I'm talking about other people, and we're always curious about like what's the boundary. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that, Adam?
I mean, it's tricky. I mean, someone once said, as soon as there's a writer in the family, there goes the family. Um, you know, I think, I mean, I think it's very different if you're thinking about satire than if I don't tend to write satire, right? I'm sort of headlong. My empathy towards most of my characters is fairly headlong. So, which is not to say that the representations people that, some of the characters, my characters have been based on would agree with everything that I wrote, but I don't feel like I'm engaged in vilification. So in a sense, of course, there's a somewhat amoral quality to it, right? There is a use of private things, but I think that's true in all arts. It's just, as Baldwin said, we work in the disastrously explicit medium of language, so that the painters and the musicians don't have to be quite so literal about it. But yeah, it's a question. That's not really an answer, but it's a question.
No, I love the more questions you're asking. Paul, do you have some thoughts on this as well?
Sure. The way I think about it, the kind of angle I come at it from is, I think as a writer, every sentence I write has to be true. And some sentences are more factually true and some sentences are more imaginatively true. And there's a kind of calculus that goes on between them. It's moving. So I use that as a and the truth is to the what I'm always writing towards sort of critical mass. I'm trying to find the story, and so at first it's very just sort of intuitive, like walking around with a dowsing rod. But once the story starts to gain its own momentum, then I'm trying to make every sentence true to it, if that makes sense. And so then fact and imagination, then I find out what the dynamic is between them on a kind of project specific basis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The music of the language starts to like take over, it sounds like. And
yeah.
This actually leads to our kind of our second question, which we were class was looking at some research on you guys, and of course you guys come from a musical background, and to some degree I know, Paul, you are or maybe currently are still a drummer, and Adam, you come from a musical background, I think, or household as well, and you're one of your main characters in your novel has a very strict philosophy about music, I guess. So I was kind of curious about how music works in terms of content or style in your work. Paul, do you want to speak to that first, maybe?
Yeah, I'm not a musician. I'm a drummer. If we had time, I could tell you my repertoire of dumb drummer jokes. So, what do you call the guy who follows the band around from town to town and go from there? But I absolutely write musically. I think language is singing way. There's something incantatory about it. When I write, I write the way that I play drums. I often start with or look for a kind of tempo, a rhythm, a time signature, counterpoint. When you're the drummer, you're the timekeeper, and narrative is keeping time as well. So I often kind of know how many beats are in a line or in a passage before I know what it's actually going to be filled in with. And I take kind of from jazz. I went early drafting sort of stuff. It's very improvisational, but I feel like it all. The signal sort of, the signal comes from the same place every time, and so if I'm sitting at a set of drums, it comes over the wire, and I precipitate it into actual drumming. If I'm at the laptop keyboard, it burns through the atmosphere as English prose, as it were. And then I have all sorts of like really feeble personal ersatz, like music theory that I think of, like I think of, what would Bach do? Contrapuntal and all this kind of theme and variation, figuratively, just thinking of it that way.
That's really interesting though. So it's not just a line itself, but like kind of in a more global way you think about it as music. I love that. Adam,
Yeah.
what does music play a role into how you think about writing or how you approach it?
I mean, certainly in all the ways Paul was talking about at the beginning, about I mean, my job daily is to write sentences, and the job of each sentence is to exist in some rhythmic relationship to the sentence before it, right? I mean, if it doesn't, then it's not working. So as Paul said, once a rhythm has been identified, you are in some sense a servant to that rhythm, and reproduce, not just reproducing it, but advancing it in some way. I am not a musical person in the least, but there are a lot of people. My brother, my partner's a composer, so there's a lot of, I've learned a lot on the more structural side over the years, but I would just say that it's, I don't know whether this is true because I was too young to remember, but I was dyslexic. And so I was taught as I read late, but I was retaught how to read. I mean, the education, you were literally given a new instruction on how to read, and it was all very phonetic. And so I think there's something, I'm a slow reader. I read every sentence, every word of every sentence. I can't really scan. And so I think there's something about that, which is just, it's always also the source of pleasure. To be the simplest, to be the most clear about it, it's what gives the most pleasure. And hard as writing is, there is a kind of hedonic baseline there that if it's not giving that pleasure, then it's not going to give it to anybody else,
Oh, I love that actually. We have one more question maybe before we get to the reading itself. And this one is kind of thinking about, yesterday in our fiction class, we were talking about how do you write about extreme topics like violence or drug abuse or any of these kind of topical things. So the question is, you guys both do this. You talked about mental illness and drug abuse. And so we're kind of curious about how do these things inform a character, and how do you approach those kind of topical themes without the character becoming like a walking diagnosis or becoming a victim of their circumstance. Paul, do you want to start off, maybe?
Sure. Sort of anecdotally, my experience is just with writing about a character who becomes addicted to opioids. The way I tried to write about it was that the subject was always the character. It was always, the character's name was Charlie, who gets himself into this jam. I think the difficulty at any given time is that there is a set of a certain popular understanding about drug addiction or this or that you just know you're going to be up against in some ways, that people, that they say the drug addiction will be the subject and the character will be the predicate of that subject. And so you can't write for those readers. And you just then it's incumbent upon you though to do your best to always make the subject of every sentence the human person who, and then whatever is subsequent to that. If you read some of the book reviews that I got for that, it didn't work, and in some cases, but I think like you said, and I'm sure Adam will confirm that, I mean, first, like when you're writing, why bother writing about anything, why bother putting anything less than everything at stake and writing about the most difficult things? And just, because otherwise you'd never be able to write about anything worth reading. So I always tell my students, don't write your books for people who won't like them, and don't write your books for people who aren't careful, attentive, solicitous readers.
That's really good advice. Adam, do you have some thoughts on this too? In particular, many of our students were interested in this idea of like writing about mental illness, and these are kind of a prevalent theme in much of your work. Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think I'm gonna agree with Paul again, but so mental illness is a phrase that barely ever appears in any of my work. And there's a reason for that, which is not that I don't think it exists, that people don't need healthcare, that it's not a reality. It's that when it comes to understanding experience and people's experience of it, the phrase mental illness is like a conceptual suitcase. It's like pre-digested, and what we tend to do is like open it up, dump a bunch of things in it that we don't really understand or frankly want to deal with, and then just say, oh, that's mental illness, and put it over there. As opposed to if we were in the 19th century, it would be called eccentricity. Do you know what I mean? There's not, we happen to live in a world in which many mental states are labeled in the culture illness, and that seems to excuse us from attending to experience. So I'm always writing from the side of what is it like to be in a mind and a body, and how do those people move through the world? Now it's true. I mean, I'm not, writing in the 19th century. So the characters I'm writing about are themselves having to interpolate themselves as being understood that way, and they're often on medication for it, et cetera. So I just think that it's really important, for the reasons that Paul was talking about, that the writer's job is to unpack things and to complicate things, not to reproduce received wisdom about what those positions are.
Yeah, mental illness is not this metaphysical, monolith that exists independently of the experience of it.
Yeah.
Right. And absolutely. So I'm thinking about, Paul, when you wrote about epilepsy and how you write about it. Of course, you don't call it that necessarily, but it's probably like a very authentic way of actually looking at epilepsy. And I know for Adam that you have related to mental illness. We read that your chapter about where the father in Imagine Me Gone, is about to attempt suicide, which is also another difficult topic, but you never mention suicide in that particular passage, and it makes it very complicated and actually like really a beautiful chapter, despite the darkness. So speaking of your work, let's get to your work, I suppose. So if you could, each of you read for 10 or 15 minutes, that would be excellent. Paul, do you want to start us off maybe?
Sure. I'll just read 2 or 3 pages from the book that I have coming out next January. It's called This Other Eden. For those of you who know your Shakespeare, it's Richard II, John of Gaunt, Richard II. And the novel is loosely based on a historical set of circumstances that occurred on. There is an island off the southern coast of Maine called Malaga Island, which from 1792 to 1912 was the site of a racially integrated community. It was begun by either escaped or freed black slave, formerly enslaved black guy, and his Irish wife from Galway. And these people lived there for 125 years until 1912, when the state of Maine summarily evicted them all from the island, all except for one family, which they charmingly sent to a place called the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, which you can imagine. And as I was thinking about, it sort of laid claim to me, and one of the, I was looking for the universe to give you a sign, and it turns out that school is the school that one of my great uncles would have been sent to, who shows up in Tinkers, my first novel. And then I found out that almost to the week that the people were evicted in July of 1912, the first International Congress for Eugenics was going on in London. And there was a lot of early eugenics sort of used to so anyways, this reading has nothing to do with that. I just thought you might be interested to know that this is just a kind of a standalone scene. One of the it's a young kid named Ethan. His name is Ethan Honey, and he has some artistic talent. He's a 15-year-old kid. He's very good at drawing, and eventually he gets sort of taken off the island before the eviction. in any case, so this is just a little set piece of him doing a drawing. Ethan split wood and fetched water and went to school lessons. And after, he took the pencil and sheet of white paper Mr. Diamond, a missionary teacher, had given him, and a flat board his father had found for him, and walked to the little bluff facing the mainland. He reached into one of his shirt's breast pockets and took out a small, dull spoon and a medicine bottle made of blue glass. He arranged the spoon and bottle on a rounded step of the bare granite at the top of the bluff, worn and pitted by glaciers. From the other shirt pocket, he gently scooped a dead chickadee he had found by the schoolhouse that morning. The bird was sleek and unruffled, its claws curled and retracted against its body. It was impossible to tell how it had died. Ethan could not believe one of the island cats had not found it first and eaten it. The body had begun to smell in his pocket during school, faintly at first, but more it seemed as the morning went along. He laid the bird in front of the medicine bottle and spoon. The noon sun was brighter, more glaring and direct than he'd have liked. He found a stick from a scrub oak and wedged it into a seam in the granite, and removed his shirt and draped it across the stick's branches, making an awning over the bottle, bird, and spoon. He sat on the granite, hunched over, and began to draw, starting with the bird. At first, the outline of the bird floated, curled, and dead in absolute white space. Then came the bottle and spoon, and the three objects rested on a common invisible plane. Ethan sweated, became hot, and distractedly wiped his face and the salty drop that ran down his forehead and hung suspended from the tip of his nose. Wind and surf reverberating against the rocks and through the trees, the noon sun unclouded and raining straight above, afternoon chores, his father and Grammy and sisters and the island itself all dissolved into a single uninterrupted buzz as Ethan drew and found the lines and their weight with the pencil, pushing its tip or easing up, observing the lines darken or lighten, lend depths or define surfaces, render light bending through the bottle, or a shiny little sun pooled in the bottom of the spoon's bowl, or still being collected in death inside the fine feathers of the chickadee's black hooded head, stored within them until the flesh they were fastened to perished and they swirled away over the rocks and off the bluff into the air, leaving only a frail little machine of bones. Ethan drew and imagined the earth after the flood and Noah's sons and wives ranging across plains and cragged hills, and wondered whether they at first found the bodies of the drowned everywhere they went, jammed under boulders, slung in the tops of dead trees, splayed on the plains, and what it must have smelled like, and the two vultures and two turkey buzzards from the ark taking up their given thrones on the jutting hip bones of the nearest corpses, and whether those first months after disembarking were spent piling the dead, large and small, into heaps and burning them in pyres that consumed families and villages. The people intermingled in the thick braided columns of black, pungent smoke that drifted up into the sky and across the land and settled back across it in a fine layer of ash in which all the seeds of the renewed world were sown, and by which they were all quickened. Ethan leaned closer and worked on the details of the little bird's mask and imagined dark Ham, these are Noah's sons, dark Ham at dusk, exhausted from dragging bodies by their ankles and keeping them in piles to burn, angered at not having been able to resist looking at the faces of the dead and trying to guess what children belonged to what mothers, what husbands belonged to what wives, what beloved servants to what kind masters, loyal and in love with every corpse, despite what his somber, sober, God-struck father had told him about their wickedness, and which he had and still wholly believed, as much as he missed the former world, standing by the radius of embers and bones left from the day's cremations, looking east across the plains and seeing the faint glow of fair Shem's, his brothers, of fair Shem's blaze at the base of the foothills in the distance. Then looking west and seeing the plated columns of smoke from coppery Japheth's fires rising near the sea, and missing both his brothers more sharply than he'd thought he'd ever have been able to imagine after having been shut up with them in that boat for so many weeks. Ethan wondered, had God spared those brothers the grim work of clearing the dead from the world? Had he made sure to rinse the lands of that first race of people, every one of them drained away with the receding waters into the bottoms of the oceans, where their myriad bones turned and settled in the profoundest depths, sifted and collected around the pilings of the earth? This island, the island he lives on, their ark, except that Noah's ark came to rest on a mountain, and he and his family scrambled down from the deck and dispersed across the world, across the Hellespont and Arabia, Egypt, and through all Africa, across the Mongolian plains in the American West, while the honeys kept to theirs and their own and left their ark as little as possible. When Noah and Japheth and Shem and Ham and their wives paraded down the gangplank onto dry land, herding moose and black bears and setting loons and wood ducks free from their cages, there was not another single soul alive on the planet. It may as well have been another planet. Ethan drew and daydreamed about the Bible stories Mr. Diamond read to him and the other school children, and the afternoon passed, and the sun burned his back and shoulders and neck. That evening, he had to lie shirtless on his stomach in the grass, while Grammy Honey spooned cold tea onto his inflamed back. Charlotte and Tabitha, his sisters, sat on either side of him and fanned him with leafy maple branches they'd stripped from a sapling. Later, during sweat-soaked bouts of sleep, a nightmare tormented him that he was suffocating in a pile of burning bodies, struggling to turn face up so he could cry out over the clamor of the flaming pyre and booming surf to frowning Japheth that he was not drowned, that spared or forgotten he was not one of the drowned. Ethan took a fever in the night, and Grammy cooled him with a rag soaked in cold, weak tea. He muttered about Noah and dead families buried in common graves, and Grammy whispered to him, "Hush, think of what a glorious month in heaven it must have been while it rained down here. All those people arriving, freed from all the evil their hearts had been set on, since every one of them had been little kids." Early the next morning, Eha, Ethan's father, rose from his sleep and looked at his sun-poisoned son, sleeping on a pallet on the floor with his sisters. Ethan was awake and heard his father shifting himself and rising off the bed, the floorboards taking his weight, the one-room shack distributing his weight throughout its joints and beams. He opened his eyes, and the burns on his back seemed to flare afresh like a bed of banked coals poked in the dark dawn. Chills swept over his back and shoulders and up his neck. Sweat popped from the pores of his face and brow and felt freezing from breaking over the hot skillet of his skin. Heat pulsed from his back. It felt as if his stomach might be sick, and he let out a quiet little sob. Eha made his way over and around the bodies of his daughters snoozing on their pallets and knelt by his son. He placed a hand on Ethan's head and stroked the boy's hair with his thumb. Such a big, strong head, such thick hair, his mother's. Such a beautiful child, just this past week an infant in my arms, a babe I could hold whole in this cupped hand. Ethan whimpered as if the effort of enduring the night let go beneath his father's touch. Eha felt the sun's heat radiating back out of his son's skin. Burned forearms, singed noses, sun-branded necks were nothing new to anyone on the island. Men, women, children were all well used to such scorching from the sun directly above and from its reflection off the mirror of the Atlantic, in which their tiny pebble of a home sloshed. Grammy had a repertoire of cures: cold tea, mint compress, macerated plantain weed. She munched leaves and spat the paste into her fingers and smeared it across the boy's back. Grammy's remedies had none of the salubrious comforts of the medicine on the mainland. No baths of cold, fresh milk or poultices of oatmeal mixed with spring water. No slab of raw beefsteak plastered over a black eye. Her compounds were spare and vaporous. Essences distilled, brewed, steeped, reduced, concentrated into drops and small thimblefuls by a medicine woman who herself mostly survived on pipe smoke, black tea, ocean air, and the word of God. She concocted salves salutary to lean lives lived on shallow soil and bare rock. So there's that.
Thank you so much. Adam, would you like to share your work with us as well?
Sure. So I'll also read from something I'm working on. It's how to describe it. It's one of the main characters is an immigration lawyer, works in asylum cases. But another one of the characters who I'm going to read from is actually the mother character, who's a retired Episcopal priest who now runs a kind of retreat center. So I'm just going to read you, it's not the first section of hers, but it's close to it. So there's not a lot that's required. She's just had she sort of had a morning meditation, and there are three people who run this, three friends, Claire being the mother character, her partner, and rather, I'm sorry, the narrator is Anne, Claire is her partner, and their friend Roberta. So the Claire that I start this with is the Anne's partner. Claire was in the meeting house already with Roberta in the big room, setting up for that morning's circle. They'd got the heat going and arranged the 4 chairs at the table in the middle. Anne crossed to the far wall and pulled the curtain back from the plate glass that looked onto the meadow and woods. Their caretaker, Jeanette, was kneeling in the vegetable patch, spreading mulch for the winter. Everyone imagined that Anne and Claire and Roberta, founders of a women's retreat in the mountains of Vermont, must be great gardeners, yet none of them were. Claire had blamed the tomato plants when they failed to thrive their first summer. Roberta was good with the tractor and a decent carpenter, but gardening she left to her husband. And Anne had simply never done it. She had never had the inclination, much less the time. Without Jeanette, the center would be a field of weeds. Who do we have this morning? Anne asked, her back still to the other two. Kathy Weber, Claire said, the hospital chaplain. She's here with the Pittsburgh group. Yes, Roberta said, the only one without 3 different food allergies, so I'm very fond of her. It was Roberta's week helping the retreatants in the kitchen, a rotation she never tired of grousing about. The 3 of them used to spend time preparing for these circles, asking each woman to write a brief essay in advance, which they would discuss as a group the night before, deciding how to approach the conversation. But Anne had come to see this as more of an impediment to spontaneity than an aid to depth, and eventually the other 2 had agreed. The knock on the door was faint but audible. Roberta went to open it and welcomed Kathy Weber in. She apologized for being late, which Claire promptly told her she wasn't. Leading her to the chairs in the center of the room, Roberta indicated for her to sit. Sunlight streaming through the side window lit the loose strands of her graying blonde hair, creating a faint halo around her head. Calm spirit, Anne thought, at least outwardly so, but tired. She smiled at them with watery eyes. Thank you for coming, Anne said. We're glad to have you here. We'll begin with a period of silence. Kathy nodded, and the 4 of them went quiet. Early on, they had worried over the length of this opening moment, using a clock on the wall, which was all wrong, and came down quickly, and then a little timer one of them would keep as if the ritual they'd invented required rules to legitimize it. But none of them experienced any such bother this morning. It was simply a matter of when the room and the people in it had settled. When they had, one of them would speak, and the circle would begin. The vision object Kathy had brought to share was rock, a clean beige oval with a pale blue cord at center, the granite perfectly divided from the sandstone surrounding, as if placed there by an artist. She set it down on the low table between them beside Roberta's beads and Claire's little Norman cross and Anne's silver flat-topped ring. She began by speaking about her job. Most people did. The concrete thing. She had gone to seminary, imagining herself becoming a parish priest, working with a congregation, and eventually leading one. But her chaplaincy internship had changed that. She thought she'd find the hospital depressing and want to be done with it as quickly as possible. But then she started tending to the dying, and the depth of the work had stunned her. Everything else fell away, the doctors and machines and grief-stricken relatives, and she felt as if she were at work in the field of almost pure spirit, overcome with thankfulness for the intimacy the dying entrusted her with. There was no need for Anne or the others to smile in acknowledgement or even nod in understanding at what Kathy was saying. They were offering their full attention. We are grounded in the decades-long friendship of our three founders, the center's website said. This friendship is what we offer to our guests as a source of guidance and renewal, which was true. Their strength was intimacy and trust. Because they could be present to one another in difficulty as well as ease, they could as a group be present to others. Most all the women who came felt this. They intuited it, especially in the circles. And so the social niceties could fall away, and with them the surface insecurities. They didn't need to signal to Kathy that they were listening. She knew. She stayed at the hospital and taken a job as the assistant chaplain. A decade had passed, and then most of another, and for years already she had been the head chaplain herself. What had begun as a revelation had become inevitably a routine. Her kids were teenagers now. They respected what she did, but didn't much want to hear about the sick and the dying. And though she had denied it throughout her divorce, she understood now it had gotten in the way of her marriage. Her husband, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it, and this she still blamed him for, could never feel as important as the final hours of other people's lives that were her daily concern. The hospital had been nonprofit, but then was sold. There were assistants to train, and now cost cuts to fight insufficient hospice care, needless suffering. She felt less present to others. Increasingly, she couldn't rid herself of the conviction that in the most important aspects of her job, she failed people precisely when they needed her most. It was in these moments, after a person finished their first unburdening of why they had sought out the center and the circle, that the urge to soothe came most strongly to Anne, to minister and to mother, and thus pass over as quickly as possible the heaviness in the room. In this case, of the passage of time and the aging of a vocation, nothing the three of them could say would reverse these, and nothing said without acknowledging this would be worth the breath of its utterance. People barely had room to grieve the loss of others, let alone pieces of themselves. And yet unmourned, such fragments were bound to haunt. Claire and Roberta would put it differently, but they agreed. The urge to solve people's problems was one of the greatest obstacles in their work, which made allowing for silence in this particular moment so important. Claire spoke first, as she usually did. It was her way. She'd been a professor of religion, the dean of a college. A certain kind of authority came readily to her. Mostly this was just a fact, not a problem. The thing acknowledged between the three of them, to be discussed when it impeded things but otherwise cherished. And mostly Anne loved her for it. She had from the beginning, this bold woman who'd nonetheless come to her for solace. You're describing a kind of contact, Claire said, a communion, which clearly means a lot to you. But the institution gets in the way, it's suffocating. The space to do the work is shrinking, it's already shrunk. Maybe it's been that way for a long time. I don't need to tell you this, but this is how we start, letting you know what we're hearing from you. It sounds like there was at least a partial container before, but now you're supposed to be the container as well, which is pretty much impossible for one person to hold the outside space and the inside. So you've been assigned an increasingly impossible thing, but you do it anyway, which is not uncommon. We're given these assignments and we make them ours. And then we blame ourselves when things break down. Roberta waited to be certain Claire was through before leaning forward slightly in her chair. The number of years we've been doing this, she said, even before all the changes you're describing, that's a lot of death. You have patients who get better. There's that too, of course. Still, over time, it's a lot of death. Where does the weight of that go? How does it move through you? Can it move through you? I'm not asking for an answer. We all know the pastoral advice. I'm just listening to your voice, and this is what I find myself wondering. Anne watched to see if Kathy would follow the natural inclination to respond right away, to do her own comforting of Roberta and Claire by telling them they were right, that they understood that yes, this was exactly it. But she didn't. Mostly, Anne imagined, because she was herself so practiced a listener, that she too had learned to resist the first anxious urge to reassure which hid more than it helped. But also she thought because Kathy had quickly picked up on the rhythm of the energy in the room, the rhythm the three of them together brought to the circle, they made silence okay. Kathy recognized this, and she seemed glad for it. From across the low table, Anne sensed Claire wanting her to speak. It was her turn, except they didn't really have turns anymore. They spoke when moved to. But Claire had her expectations. She always had her strong view of how things should go. They'd struggled with this over the years, the three of them, but also the two of them, very much so, because there could be a violence in how Claire spoke about what needed to be done in any situation, a force of presumption that bordered on dismissal, in which she acknowledged was at odds with the mutual discernment the group process they'd committed themselves to from the beginning. Those being foundational commitments to not replicate amongst themselves the structures of power they had created this place to be free of. So even when a want of Claire's might be nothing more than that, there was an added step for Anne of noticing if she felt pushed by her partner, commanded even. She'll never have your skills of spirit, Roberta had said to Anne once, no matter how hard she tries, and that will always make part of her jealous. But you know that already. You just wish you didn't. I think I'm just listening, Anne said eventually, her eye catching again on the nimbus of light glowing around Kathy's head, giving her the appearance of an angel in middle age, a once young celestial spirit confined too long to earth. But I am curious about something. You were doing chaplaincy before you had children, and you've done it ever since. Did it change after they were born? Did the work change for you? Kathy smiled meekly, but with some pleasure. Do you know, she said, that's something I've been thinking about. Probably because they're almost grown, and I'll be on my own again. But I must have thought of it when they were little, how it was affecting us, but there was always something else to be done, other people to care for. I guess mostly I just carried on. My husband wanted me to stop, or at least to take a year off. He thought after that I wouldn't want to go back. But I'd been made head chaplain, so I got to arrange things the way I wanted them to be for the first time, really. So I wanted to stay, I did. But I've been thinking about it, because you're right, every day, people at the very end of their life, dying people, and then suddenly these little creatures, ravenous for life, taking everything I could give, with no pasts, no regrets, no thanks, like creatures from some other universe. Maybe I should have taken time off. Maybe my brain just couldn't live in both places at once. Am I going on too long here? I can stop if there's an order I should follow in what I'm telling you. No, Claire said, you keep right on going. Thank you, Kathy said. I've led groups for years. I'm just always the one leading them, so I'm out of practice speaking like this. Which is why people come here, Roberta said, exactly that. Kathy smiled again, less meekly this time. It's amazing how much I've forgotten, she said. All the things that I tell other people. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, appreciate that. And we actually have a couple questions that are kind of popping up while you were reading. And I was thinking about these too. A couple questions were pertaining to research. And so the question is, how extensive is your research? And at what point does the research end and the author start making stuff up? So maybe we can follow the same order. Think about Paul, maybe thinking about historical research based on the event that you are obviously kind of told us about. But I was also kind of curious while you were reading, is like, how do you stay so specific to a time periods like language, or, how do you avoid anachronism? So Paul, do you want to speak a little bit to research and historical fiction?
I'm almost unconscious of doing research, although I think I do it all the time. Like I've become very good at keyword, just Googling things and going down the rabbit hole with that. But to me, it's on a strictly as needed basis. I don't do a bunch of research, and I partly with this set of historical circumstances. I very much didn't want the book to be historical fiction. I didn't want it to be about the actual place. I'm not pretending it's not about it, but I just wanted that distinction to be very, very razor sharp and always maintained. So often enough, what I would do is I would go and find, there's not tons and tons of information about the, it's the sort of a few articles in Down East magazine, like sort of like not, but sometimes I would go to actually find out what, like, I didn't want to overlap what actually happened. So I'd find out what happened in order to sort of come up with a kind of imagined counterpoint, partially because, these families, the families with the last names are still up around there. And it's, but mostly my research is sort of like, what would that kind of a boat that he was rowing across the, across the bay, what would that be? Or what's that part of this? Or, kind of very, like very, very granular kind of verisimilitude sorts of stuff. Partially because when Adam and I were in school together, got our MFAs together, and the whole time I was there, I was working on this novel about a 12-year-old girl who disguises herself as a boy in order to work in a silver mine in colonial Mexico in the 16th century. And I was just, I just got so, because it was supposed to be an homage to my two favorite novels at the time, Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain and Carlos Fuentes' Terra Nostra, but I was writing from the outside in. I was writing from high concept data. It took me a month to research every single sentence. So finally, I just like, this is just a costume drama. And when I turned to Tinkers, the beautiful thing about Tinkers is I have it all in my fingertips. I don't have to do any research. So that's still sort of an ideal of mine. And then it becomes, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to do research because I just sort of meander. And so I'm always dredging up sort of things that interest me about history, that sort of thing. Again, I never did any research about epilepsy, for example, for Tinkers. I just knew if I tried to write about it objectively and tried to get the reader to believe something I was presenting as objective in order to believe in my book, it would never work. So I just did that thing where this is the character who has epilepsy, and for him, it's to pick up on what Adam said, this is what it's like. That's what it's just describing things experientially, So I don't know if that's sort of a far-ranging answer, but.
Absolutely. I mean, for Adam, I was thinking the same thing, where it's like you were looking at a particular setting, a job, a community, and how do you get into that community through research? And as he says, when do you start doing research and when do you start making things up?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for this book, I would say the more sort of standard research has come in with the asylum lawyer, immigration lawyer context. Then I went to law school. I know a lot of immigration lawyers. I've spent a certain amount of time sitting in immigration court down in Lower Manhattan. So that's sort of the more kind of classic, going into the world, learning it. But then, really, you're learning the language of something, right? You're learning because that's what you're going to be creating as language. So it's a bit like a dialect, and the key is not to write something that immigration lawyers are going to use in their classes as examples, but rather to create something that you just have to get far enough into the language to understand how people use it as people, how people deploy it, and so that really takes a long time, but it doesn't, I would say, like Paul, it's very much as needed. I don't research for 2 years and then sit in front of my folders and start doing it. It's just, I know I want somebody to be in this circumstance. I just have to know enough of the language to know how they would go about doing it in this moment, and how this person, so the forces, the actual social forces aren't fantastical, that they're arrayed in a way that they would be. But it can be quite irritating, because, I mean, in some sense, because then you get in the middle of a scene, you're like, damn, I don't know this other thing. Do you know what I mean? And then you've got to sort of scurry off or, cheat around it for a while or whatever. But yeah, but I think, a book should be, people ask, when is a book done? It's like, it should be done when it doesn't interest you anymore. And when it doesn't interest you is kind of when you're done researching it,
a great, great way to think about it. We have maybe time for one more question. We had one from the Q&A, and it corresponds to another question we got before the reading. The question we got before the reading was like, as novelists, how do you approach process to such a large writing project, maybe in comparison to like short stories? And then we got a Q&A question that says, when writing, do you start with a plan or begin writing and end up with something you really like and work off that? So I guess thinking about planning and how do you approach different sizes of projects? Adam, would you like to begin maybe thinking about process?
Sure. When it comes to the idea of how to approach writing a novel, I want to say with despair and stubbornness, you know, that you're never not despairing that it'll ever get done. And the only real antidote to that is the sort of stubbornness that I can't go on, I must go on. The only thing worse than not writing, or the only thing worse than writing is not writing. So in terms of choice of it, I don't think there's a lot of that in it. I mean, I wrote short stories for a long time. I very occasionally still do. It just, I think the arcs that I'm interested in just don't suit themselves to a short story. That may be different at a different time, but at the moment that's true. And I forgot the second question.
Oh, just thinking about like, do you start off with a plan or do you just?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, I don't. I start out with usually a person alone in a room somewhere, looking out a window often. I mean, that sounds like a cliche, but often that's true. And then it's just like 5 years of questions, like who are they? What are they doing? Why are they there? Who are they waiting for? You know, it just, and then of course you discover things like, oh, this guy's an immigration lawyer, and then there goes another couple of years. You know, so yeah, the plan, and then the further you get, the more, you know, you get a sense of where it's going. But I'm not an outliner. I've never been an outliner.
Paul, do you have?
Yeah, no, I'm very much echoing what, you know, Adam. It's like you get up in the morning, you pick up the shovel, you get back in the ditch, and you just sort of just keep going. And it is like you have faith in process, man. You know, because there is one day we go, hey, wait a minute, now I've got another one of these things on my hand, you know. And the same thing, like I couldn't write a short story if, you know, my mother's life depended on it. I've completed the third manuscript that that will be published. And I write the entire, over the roughly 8 or 9 years I've spent writing this book, no matter how much I added, and then how much I took away, and then how much I added again, or whatever. The manuscript was 59,000 words, like dead on the whole time. At the very end, you know, my editor, you know, like got me. She said, could you elaborate a little bit on this part? It's like just up to 6. But it's like I feel like it's a type of MRI of my brain, kind of. You know, this is about the side story. This is how long I'm interested in it. The way Adam's, you know, and I just write by intuition. And one day I'm sort of like, I think I told myself the story. You know, and I think I write this in a similar way. I'm thinking about Adams and my mutual friend and teacher, Marilyn Robinson, who described the way she writes is, I don't write declarative prose, I write interrogatively. You know, the sentence is the method of inquiry. And I'm just asking questions and asking it to elaborate. And it's I think of it as in physics, it's called emergence, you know, which is this kind of, you know, this is the poet's version of this theory, but it's, you know, for a system of a certain amount of complexity, there will arise properties once it is set in motion that never could have been theoretically predicted prior to its activation. And so I'm always looking for that kind of, you know, just the emergence of, oh, that's who you are. Oh, I didn't, you know. I'm looking for revelation, kind of writing towards revelations, and hoping that the trail of prose that the reader follows me, you know, behind, reproduces that experience that I had of, you know, minus all the agony. You know, like, I'll spare you. You just get the, you know, the fruits of the labor.
And that makes a lot of sense. Maybe like a quick follow. We were just talking about this with our class, whereas like short stories tend to have like a little bit more of like a parameters of like, here's the traditional length of a short story. Novels can be anything. And so we were curious about, and this is a practical question, I guess, but just thinking about like length of novels, do you ever consider like, oh, this is maybe too short to be a novel, or it's like, maybe this is getting a little big and I need to like rethink how it works? Or do you even consider the size when it comes to the novel? Adam, do you consider these things?
Well, yes. But it's hard really to say how. I mean, because there's always something sort of Frankensteinian in as much as there's a bunch of pieces and they are eventually going to be stapled together, because those are the things that interest you and they will, you know, again, somewhat stubbornly be put together. So I think a lot about the size of the pieces. You know, I think a lot about like this chapter or section. Is it too short? Like, has it not breathed, or am I just kind of whining on here? Is there something I can remove? And then, particularly in this current book, because it's actually structured quite differently on the page than anything I've written before, I'm thinking a lot about the relationship between those. So, you know, what length of section comes after what length of section, you know, and how does that, where's the reader sort of, do they need breathing space here? I mean, it's again, somewhat musically, like, is there a rest here, you know, or a sustain? So the overall, I mean, like every 6 months, I count it to sort of see like roughly where am I. I'm never in danger of being bruised. I mean, I have no, for any number of reasons. I'm never going to write 1,000 pages. I mean, I'm too much of a pointillist. So yeah, if there's a concern, it's just that I've been too spare.
Makes sense. It's like that musical, the beats and the
yeah.
And Paul, you tend to write like sometimes like smaller novels, or like not the grandiose Proustian novels. So
yeah, no, it's funny because as a reader, I like nothing better than a book of, you know, the thickness of a brick or greater. I love living in Proust for, you know, months and years on end, just looping back and starting again, and Moby Dick but I just don't have that it's like musicians. Some musicians, you know, I wouldn't listen to the kind of music we play. You know, the type of writer you are is not necessarily the type of writing you admire as a reader, or you see it may not come over the wire quite the same way. But I feel the same with putting pieces of a novel together, very musically and very much, I think, in terms of key and harmonics. You know, I've just left the reader with this note ringing in their ear at the end of this section. What's going to happen when they hit the first note of this next section? Will there be a dissonance, a harmony? You know, that, and just how you lead the reader, how you kind of curate the reader's way through the book. Length to me is you just try to write the story, and then you say to the marketing department or production team, like, I think we need a bigger font. You know, to me, I never ever think about length. It's just the story. Write the story, the whole story, and nothing but the story, and then you think about publishing. You know, and for me, revision is a matter of just trying to write as precisely as I can. So if sometimes I overwrite and then just try to distill it down to so I'm never really, and I couldn't sustain that over 500 or 600 pages. It would just be too dense. I couldn't, you know, I would drive myself crazy, you know. So I try to, my ideal, this is not what I claim, but my ideal is to write books that are about 175 pages long, but 1,000 pages deep. Mm. You know, good luck. Good luck.
That's a wonderful note for us to end on, I think. Thank you so much for both of you spending the hour with us and sharing your work. It's been a pleasure. It's so fun to talk to you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Thank you guys for showing up or watching the recording. And once again, if you want a copy of their work on the house, please contact me and we'd be more than happy to get it in your hands. All right. So once again, thank you so much. And I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Great seeing you, Adam.
Right,
Talk
thanks.
Good
soon.
to see you, Paul. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.